On October 23rd of 2019, Terminator Dark Fate, the sixth installment of the Terminator franchise, began its international rollout, before premiering in the United States on November 1st. Like its immediate predecessor, Terminator Genisys, Dark Fate ignores everything but the original two movies and is intended to start a new trilogy. In other words, the two most recent movies have both rebooted everything but the original two movies, only to subsequently fail at launching trilogies of their own. How could the Terminator franchise end up in such a state where each new installment tries to undo the previous ones? Wasn't Dark Fate supposed to be different since it marked James Cameron's return to the franchise? We shall see, for in this video we will explore the Terminator franchise as a whole, how the rights changed hands several times over, and what Cameron's role has really been through it all. If you like this video, then please help share it if you haven't done so already, hit the subscribe button, and be sure to indicate you want notifications on all videos. In late 1981, then 27-year-old James Cameron was working on his directorial debut, Piranha 2, when he fell ill and had a fever-induced nightmare involving a metal body holding knives, dragging itself away from a fire and towards him. This image stuck with him, and he incorporated it into a new project, a John Carpenter-inspired slasher where the killer was a machine rather than a masked madman. Taking more inspiration from both The Outer Limits and Mad Max 2, Cameron developed the idea into The Terminator, and decided to make it his next feature film. The story would follow Sarah Connor, who in the future would give birth to the leader of the human resistance in the war against the machines. When the war was lost for the machines, they would send a Terminator back in time to kill Sarah Connor, before she could give birth to the human leader who would ultimately defeat them. The Resistance, however, would send the soldier back in time, Kyle Reese, to protect Sarah Connor, bringing the conflict into the contemporary era. Cameron insisted on both writing and directing it. At a time when he was still a no-name director, the bigger studios weren't interested in taking that gamble. Instead, he sold the project and in the process the Terminator rights in their entirety to producer Gale Ann Hurd for just $1, in return for a guarantee that he would both write and direct. Gale Ann Hurd then proceeded to sell 50% of the Terminator rights to John Daly of the HEMDALE Film Corporation, in return for HEMDALE funding the movie, which would be distributed by Orion Pictures. As such, both Orion and HEMDALE had to say over the production and who would be cast in it. While Cameron originally wanted his friend Lance Henriksen to star as the Terminator, the studio had their eyes set on O.J. Simpson. For Kyle Reese, the last hope of the human resistance, they wanted Arnold Schwarzenegger, the rising star of Conan the Barbarian. They insisted that Cameron meet with him for a lunch appointment, which Cameron reluctantly agreed to, although he had no intention of casting this larger-than-life oak as Kyle Reese. Over the course of lunch, however, Arnold impressed him. Not just with the force of the winning personality that had taken him from the countryside of Austria to the top of bodybuilding and the Hollywood in crowd, but also with his take on how the Terminator needed to be portrayed. Before the meal was finished, Cameron knew he had found his Terminator. He sold Orion and HEMDALE on the idea of using Arnold as the villain instead of the hero, which they were happy with. After all, O.J. Simpson wasn't that believable as a stone-cold killer anyway. However, Arnold was under contract with Dino De Laurentiis to make 5 Conan movies for him. Until his contract was up, De Laurentiis had to sign off on Arnold starring in anything else. He did, but only on the condition that Arnold shoot Conan the Destroyer for him first, which meant that production on the Terminator had to be pushed back by close to a year. The production waited for him, and the cast was rounded out with Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor and Michael Biehn as Kyle Reese. The movie was filmed at night, guerrilla style, and not always with the necessary permits in place. But Cameron had a clear vision and knew exactly what he was doing and what he wanted. He and Arnold clashed on set a couple of times, such as during the filming of the "I'll be back" scene. Arnold was still new to the English language and didn't quite get contractions. To him, "I'll be back" sounded girly. In his mind, the manly and machine-like thing to do was to spell out "I will be back." Another time, Arnold wanted the Terminator to try a sip of beer and get a momentary buzz. On both occasions, Cameron made it abundantly clear who was the director and who was hired to read lines exactly as they were written and act as instructed. This always resolved any issue, and Arnold would later admit how right Cameron had been. Orion didn't know how to market the movie, which might have hurt it at the box office. The movie nonetheless grossed nearly $80 million 1984 worldwide, which made the film very profitable given the production cost of less than $7 million. The movie would serve to further the careers of both Arnold and Cameron in a major way. Sylvester Stallone was the action hero of the early to mid-1980s. However, the combination of Conan and the Terminator gave Arnold the springboard to become the action hero of the late 1980s to early 1990s, while Cameron went on to write First Blood Part 2 and direct both Aliens and The Abyss. Both Arnold and Cameron were, however, committed to return to the Terminator at some point in the future. The 7-year gap between the first two Terminator movies came down to two things. First, Cameron was waiting for technology to catch up to his vision and make it possible to realize on screen, which he felt it was after making The Abyss. Second, and more importantly, there was the rights situation. Gale Ann Hurd, whom Cameron had married and divorced since making the first movie, still had her 50% share of the Terminator rights, and she was open to working on a sequel. However, HEMDALE had the other 50%, and they were having financial difficulties, and were in no position to proceed with another Terminator feature film. This situation was resolved when Arnold Schwarzenegger suggested to Andrew Vajna and Mario Casar, the producers behind Red Heat and Total Recall, that their production company Coralco buy HEMDALE's 50% share in the Terminator rights. In 1990, the deal went through, and development on Terminator 2 pressed ahead at lightning speed. Linda Hamilton reprised her role as Sarah Connor. Arnold returned as a new Terminator. Robert Patrick portrayed the terrifying new Terminator model, and Edward Furlong made his acting debut as the young John Connor. Coming in at a production cost of close to $100 million in 1991 dollars, Terminator 2 was the most expensive movie ever made up until then. Upon its release in the summer of 1991, it blew both audiences and reviewers away, not for just its action and story beats, but for its groundbreaking visual effects that hold up to this day. Financially, the movie was a smash hit, grossing more than $500 million worldwide, which made it the highest-grossing movie of 1991. On its long list of accomplishments, however, there was one thing it did not do: leave the door open for any sequels. On screen, Judgment Day, which in Terminator 2 had been dated to 1997, had been stopped. In actual reality, however, 1997 did represent a Judgment Day of sorts for Coralco Pictures. The studio had gone bankrupt after the film Cutthroat Island flopped worse than any movie had until then. Coralco's 50% share of the Terminator rights were auctioned off and sold to two very familiar faces: Coralco founders Andrew Vajna and Mario Casar, who took the Terminator rights with them to the newly formed company C2 Pictures. 1 year later, they were able to buy the other 50% of the rights from Gale Ann Hurd. For the first time, Gale Ann Hurd initially bought the Terminator rights from Cameron for $1. The rights were back under one roof. The Terminator was the biggest franchise in C2's portfolio. More than that, outside of Basic Instinct, it was the only brand in C2's portfolio, so they were very keen to get moving on Terminator 3. However, at this time, James Cameron wasn't interested in returning for another. From his point of view, the story was done. Cameron, however, did give Arnold his blessing to return, so he did. Arnold's career had been in a slump since his 1997 open-heart surgery, so when Terminator 3 was being developed, he was eager to return. While he already had political aspirations at this point, he only had very loose plans of possibly running for governor of California in the 2006 election. Linda Hamilton was invited back, but declined because she didn't like the script. Edward Furlong had since revealed that he was also invited back as he was momentarily clean from his substance abuse problems. However, he celebrated his return to the franchise so hard that he overdosed on cocaine and immediately got himself fired. The role of John Connor would be recast with actor Nick Stahl, while Claire Danes was cast as Connor's destined wife, Kate Brewster. U571 director Jonathan Mostow will replace James Cameron as director, and in the summer of 2003, Terminator 3: The Rise of the Machines was received to mostly positive reviews. While the movie was successful relative to its budget, it grossed only $433 million worldwide, less than Terminator 2, even unadjusted for inflation. Upon release, James Cameron simply described Terminator 3 as great, yet many fans were critical that the movie had resorted to self-referential comedy. Even so, it was successful enough to warrant the sequel that C2 had outlined, and they were planning on bringing back the surviving cast from Terminator 3 for it. However, this sequel could not have Arnold. After Terminator 3 had wrapped shooting, a recall election would be held in California. This gave Arnold the opportunity to run for governor of California already in 2003, 3 years earlier than the next scheduled election. Arnold capitalized on his chances and won, but this meant he had to drop out of both the fourth Terminator movie and the third Conan movie, which Conan the Barbarian writer John Milius was developing at the time. Unrelated to that, development on Terminator 4 came to a halt due to scripting issues, attentions being divided between the next movie and the in-development TV series Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles, and C2's increasingly precarious financial situation. Outside of Terminator, they did not have a lot going for them and eventually fell into bankruptcy again. This time, the Terminator rights were taken over by the Halcyon Company. With the financial backing of the Pacificorp hedge fund, the Halcyon Company swooped in to buy the Terminator rights. Their intention was to scrap C2's planned Terminator 4 and instead make a new Terminator trilogy, albeit one that loosely followed the events of Terminator 3. Schwarzenegger would not be in it, as he was Governor of California at the time. The first installment of this new trilogy, the McG.directed Terminator Salvation, had a new take. The twist of the movie and the entire trilogy was that despite all the hype and legends surrounding him, John Connor, now portrayed by Christian Bale, wasn't the leader he was cracked up to be. In the final act, he would even die, but his face would be transplanted onto Marcus, the cybernetically enhanced human played by Sam Worthington. Then Marcus would take on the mantle of John Connor and become John Connor, the savior of humanity, in the next two movies. This plot, ending in all, leaked online and caused some backlash among fans. Rather than sticking to their guns and the vision they had started, the filmmakers caved in to the pressure and changed direction midstream. They reshot the ending so that John Connor survived the injuries that originally killed him by way of receiving Marcus's heart, and by implication his courage in a transplant. However, by altering the twist they had built towards, they undermined the main storyline of the trilogy, or at least they would have if the sequels had ever been made. Salvation had underperformed due to the movie's astronomical production cost, and the Halcyon Company crumbled in the subsequent infighting between producers and financiers. Today, Terminator Salvation is perhaps most remembered for the behind-the-scenes incident in which the director of photography walked on the set to check the lights, something which distracted Christian Bale. Bale proceeded to voice his displeasure over being interrupted, and the audio of this was leaked online.
I want you off the fucking set, you prick!
I'm sorry.
No, don't just be sorry. Think for one fucking second. Are you professional or not?
Yes, I am.
Do I fucking walk around and rip down? No, shut the fuck up, Bruce. Do I want? No! No! Don't shut me up. Am I gonna walk around and rip your fucking lights down in the middle of a scene? Then why the fuck are you walking right through? Da-da-da-da, like this in the background. What the fuck is it with you? What don't you fucking understand? You got any fucking idea about, hey, it's fucking distracting having somebody walking up behind Bryce in the middle of the fucking scene? Give me a fucking answer!
I was looking at the light.
Oh, good for you. And how was it? I hope it was fucking good because it's useless now, isn't it? McG, you got fucking something to say to this prick?
I didn't see it happen.
Well, somebody should be fucking watching and keeping an eye on him.
Fair enough.
This is the second time that he doesn't give a fuck about what is going on in front of the camera.
No, what it is looking at the light and making sure that you are...
I'm gonna fucking kick your fucking ass. You know, shut up for a second, all right? I'm gonna go. Do you want me to go fucking trash your lights? Do you want me to fucking trash them? Then why are you trashing my scene?
I'm not trying to trash.
You are trashing my scene. You do it one more fucking time, and I ain't walking on this set if you're still hired. I'm fucking serious. You're a nice guy. You're a nice guy, but I don't fucking cut it when you're bullshitting and fucking around like this on set. Seriously, man, you and me, we're fucking done professionally.
A remixed version of Bale's rant even went viral.
No, fuck, no! 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 What don't you fucking understand? I'm gonna fucking kick your fucking ass. What don't you fucking understand? I'm gonna fucking kick your fucking ass. What don't you fucking understand?
Arnold Schwarzenegger does not appear in Terminator Salvation. Instead, the T-800 which appeared in the movie was played by Roland Kickinger on set, who then had Arnold's face animated on top of his in post-production. Upon Salvation's release, the real Arnold said that it was a great film. But that was upon release. 3 years later, he admitted he always thought it was awful. Also upon release, James Cameron gave some backhanded compliments, saying Sam Worthington, who just so happened to be the star of Cameron's Avatar, was awesome because he's always awesome. Other than that, he didn't feel it did enough to stand on its own, and that it lacked the Schwarzenegger presence of authenticity. However, he went to great lengths to stress that it wasn't bad, that it wasn't embarrassing, and it didn't let the franchise down in some great way. That being code for that he thought it was bad, that it was embarrassing, and that it let the franchise down in a great way. We know this because just 1 year later, he said that he had no desire to return to direct another Terminator movie because the franchise had, in his own words, run its course, and that it is a soup that's been pissed in by other filmmakers, which sums up his true feelings towards Terminator 3 and Terminator Salvation. Interestingly, he also said he would not want to be a dog in the manger and disallow his friends from making a little money off the franchise. In other words, he never liked the sequels since Terminator 2, and any praise he gave upon them wasn't genuine. However, he praised them anyway to help out his friends who were in them. For the movie-going audience, this meant that there was no way of knowing if any future James Cameron endorsement was genuine, or only stated to help out his friends still involved with the movies. Following the collapse of the Halcyon Company, their funding partner, the hedge fund Pacificor, took over the rights. In 2012, the rights were bought by Megan Ellison and her company Annapurna Pictures. However, there was a catch. A recent clarification in copyright law meant that the rights would revert to James Cameron in October of 2019, 35 years after the release of the original. Annapurna fully intended for a new Terminator trilogy to be made and completed by then, so time was of the essence. To make this trilogy, Megan Ellison and Annapurna Pictures teamed up with Skydance Pictures, who would co-produce and co-fund the movie alongside Paramount Pictures. Overseeing the production as main producer was Skydance CEO David Ellison, who just so happened to be Megan Ellison's brother. Ellison's take for the new trilogy was that all previous failed trilogy starters and other lackluster Terminator installments would be assigned to alternate realities and subsequently ignored. Only the first two James Cameron directed movies would be treated as canon. Then the story would be continued from there in a brand new trilogy. For all intents and purposes, this would soft reboot the franchise. Terminator Genisys would thus serve as the real Terminator 3 and use a twist involving John Connor as its foundation, but put the female lead into the spotlight. Although James Cameron would not direct the film himself, he would heavily endorse and even consult on the film. The movie was directed by Alan Taylor of Thor: The Dark World, and while it did decent numbers internationally, it didn't even clear $100 million over the course of its entire run at the domestic box office. The two planned sequels were scrapped. Like Terminator Salvation before it, Genisys had failed to launch a trilogy. Adding insult to injury, James Cameron later admitted that, like before, he had only endorsed Genisys as a favor to his friend Arnold Schwarzenegger. He never held the movie itself in much regard. Over at rival studio Universal, the executives were paying close attention to how Terminator Genisys performed. They had spent the last couple of years developing Legend of Conan, the long-awaited third Conan movie featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger's return to the iconic role, which first made him a leading man and a movie star. Universal were ready to pull the trigger and give the production a green light when Terminator Genisys flopped. Then, they pulled the plug instead. It was public knowledge that come 2019, the Terminator rights would revert back to James Cameron. Many held out hope that when he did, Cameron would reboot Terminator himself and do it right. They were hoping against hope. Even if Terminator Genisys had failed, Skydance CEO and Terminator Genisys producer David Ellison wasn't ready to let the franchise slip from his grasp. As early as in 2016, Ellison approached Cameron about entering into a licensing deal that would allow him and Skydance to continue making Terminator movies even after the rights reverted. As mentioned earlier, Cameron considers the Terminator franchise to have run its course. He never had any intention to return to direct another. He is, however, happy to see his friends profit from the Terminator movies. Since he wasn't making any more either way, he did enter a licensing agreement with David Ellison. This deal would see Cameron get a bigger cut, but allow Ellison to continue being in charge of the Terminator franchise. The deal was indirectly made public in January of 2017 with the announcement of the upcoming Terminator Dark Fate to be directed by Tim Miller, formerly of Deadpool. Dark Fate was intended to kickstart a new trilogy. In what should sound like a broken record by now, Ellison's take for the new trilogy was that all the previous failed trilogy starters or other lackluster Terminator installments never happened. Only the first two James Cameron directed movies would be treated as canon, then the story would be continued from there in a brand new trilogy. For all intents and purposes, this would soft reboot the franchise. Terminator Dark Fate would thus serve as the real Terminator 3 and use a twist involving John Connor as its foundation, but put the female lead into the spotlight. Once again, James Cameron would not direct the film himself. He would heavily endorse it and even consult on it. Outside of helping out in the first scripting stage, and then later in the editing bay, his involvement has been greatly inflated. In an interview with Variety, director Tim Miller even states that Before we brought in screenwriters, we did a room with novelists at my request, because they're world builders and we're reinventing the franchise. About Cameron, Miller went on to say, Jim has moved to New Zealand to focus on Avatar. I saw him a couple of times when I got back from shooting, and I showed him a director's cut. Jim will come in and provide clarity in key moments about the goals of the franchise. He's great about looking at things and saying, this needs to be reinforced. He's like a diver into a pool. He dives to the bottom, jumps out, and the pool settles. That's another way of saying Cameron's focus is on Avatar. While he may have been more involved with this Terminator more than any other since Part 2, his role is still mostly ceremonial. The real driving forces behind Terminator Dark Fate are director Tim Miller and producer David Ellison. If past performance is anything to go by, the odds of Dark Fate being sufficiently successful to justify producing the final 2 installments of the trilogy it is intended to herald are decidedly grim. If Dark Fate also ends up another failed trilogy starter, the future of the franchise is uncertain. However, in many ways, the Terminator franchise is past its expiration date, and in many ways, it should perhaps never have been a franchise at all. As we have seen, James Cameron is of the opinion that the story concluded with Part 2. That is indeed where his creative control and input ended. Every subsequent movie were made by other parties who happened to get a hold of the rights, and purely for financial reasons. There was never a natural progression to the story concluded with Terminator 2, which may be part of the reason why every single movie failed to spawn the planned direct sequels. Instead, they were rebooted by the next movie, and more often than not, substantial amounts of investor money was lost in the process. Sometimes, leaving well enough alone may be the best course of action. Let us know your thoughts on the Terminator franchise in the comments.